you. Están traduciendo para los que traen este aparato y lo quieren usar. El doctor Prieto va a estar traduciendo. Cuando tengamos a personas con talento y formación médica, les prometo, hermanos, que no traduciré yo, hermanos queridos, sino que traeremos a alguien que pueda entender el idioma. I'm going to ask you to do something uncomfortable, friends. I don't know if that's going to be possible. Is there any way that I can have some of you that are way off in the distance? I can't really see you too well. Is it possible to have you come up a little bit closer so I can see you in the eyeballs a little bit more intimately and we can really have a nice talk tonight? No nos tengan miedo por allá atrás. We are going to get started, so we are grateful this evening that you can come out. Dr. Pam Litvak will be sharing 4 talks with us this weekend. And I personally have been very blessed by some of our conversations that we've had regarding this topic. We're very blessed here at Antioch to have Dr. Litvak with her experience in neuroscience. It's always beautiful to me to see our scientists that believe in God take the scientific information and show how it blends in with Scripture or show how it affirms biblical principles in different ways. That's always been a real joy to see. And Pam, it's just nice to have you here. Please, can you tell us a little bit about your background this evening? And before we do that, though, let's have prayer. Would you stand with me? Let's talk to the Lord, and then I'll give it over to Pam, and she can share with us her background, and then she can get right into the talk. Let's bow our heads together. Father in heaven, we are so thankful this evening for the opportunity that we have to come and learn about the intricacies of how you've created us, how we think, how the brain functions, how this all impacts our relationship with you, our relationship with each other, how it impacts our health. And so we're just grateful that we have this opportunity to have Pam sharing with us this weekend, oh Lord. Would you please bless us and bless her mind, bless her lips as she shares what you've impressed and inspired her over the years. In Jesus' precious name, amen. Amen. You may be seated.
Happy Sabbath, and thank you all for coming this evening. I really appreciate you being here. While I'm telling you a little bit about myself, I'd like you to do one more thing for me. I'm trying something new. This is not something that I've ever tried to do in a live talk before, but I'm trying to make my talks a little bit more interactive, which means that there are some points in this talk where I'd like you to be able to answer some questions that I pose. And in order to do that, you need to get connected to a service called Poll Everyone. There are 2 ways that you can connect. The first way is through their website. The second way is probably easier. It's through your phone. So all you have to do is get into your texting app on your phone, text to the number 22333. That's the number that you would text to. It's there on the right side of the screen, 22333. And then in the text message, you would type Pamela Litvak 160. No spaces, no caps, just Pamela Litvak 160. So if you text to the number 22333, and then you text in the message Pamela Litvak 160, you'll be connected to this service. It's called Poll Everyone. You should see an automatic message appear saying that you've been connected or that you've entered this polling service, and then you'll be able to answer the questions. Now, I think that with the level of service that I have, you should all be able to connect. All right. So to answer or to tell you a little bit about myself, I went to Andrews University as an undergraduate. I was actually a pre-med student there and went through the whole process of applying to med school, and I actually got accepted to med school. But then by the end of my time at Andrews, I kind of went through this period where I was wondering if medicine was what I wanted to do, because I really loved to teach. That's kind of where my heart was. So I decided to go the academic route instead. I eventually went to SUNY Stony Brook, that's State University of New York at Stony Brook, and that's where my husband and I, Oleg, met because we were in the same grad program there. We went there for it was a PhD in neurobiology. So my specialty, my research field is neurobiology. I ended up working with a woman whose specialty was in stress. So we started to research together the effects of stress on mental health. What I didn't know, I mean, this was I was going to say coincidence, but probably not. What I didn't know at the time is that my stepdad, who is an Adventist minister, was also very interested in stress. And he was, at the same time, kind of developing some stress management seminar materials at the same time that I was going through school and learning kind of the scientific side. So I came home one time for a vacation, and that's when we finally realized that we were kind of on these parallel tracks, and we started working together, developing some stress management materials. So all of these years later, you are reaping the benefits of a lot of this work. A lot of the work that I'm presenting tonight and tomorrow goes back a couple decades of research and writings that we've done together. So I hope you've gotten connected, and let's get started here. When we were first developing these materials, and this was a few years back, it was during the holiday season, and I was listening to some music, and one of the songs that I was listening to was this song by Stephen Collins Foster. I don't know if any of you know who that is. He was considered the father of American music back in the 1800s. And he wrote this song. This is not one of his more famous songs, but here are the lyrics to one of his songs. Let us pause in life's pleasures and count its many tears while we all sup sorrow with the poor. There's a song that will linger forever in our ears. Oh, hard times, come again no more. 'Tis the song, the sigh of the weary. Hard times, come again no more. Many days you have lingered around my cabin door. Oh, hard times, come again no more. He wrote that song in 1854, shortly before the Civil War started. Stephen Collins Foster himself actually had a very difficult life. He had an alcoholic father who eventually pushed the whole family to the brink of poverty. He himself was very famous. Even during his lifetime, he was famous because he was this awesome songwriter that everyone in the world knew about. But he never made much money at it because at that time in the 1800s, there weren't really any copyright protections for people who wrote songs and such. In 1861, his wife left him, took their daughter with her. In 1864, he died at the relatively young age of 37. All they found in his possessions was one small scrap of paper that said Lonely Hearts on it, and then there were a few pennies of Civil War script that was pretty much worthless at that time. So Stephen Collins Foster's life is kind of an example of what we're talking about tonight. The link between stress and mental health, the link between stress and issues like depression and anxiety. Depression is something that many people experience multiple times over the course of their lifetime. So if we visualize life as a road that we're all traveling, depression is like a shadow that falls multiple times across the road. And every time we fall underneath that shadow, a lot of the joy that we normally experience in life leaves. And instead we feel things like guilt and anger and despair and hopelessness. It's statistically said that about 1 out of maybe 15 Americans are dealing with depression at any given time. But some people, they experience stress in their life, but they don't actually get depressed over it. They don't actually experience any mental health issues over it. And what I wanted to know as I was studying this in school and afterwards is, what makes those people different? Is there something that I can learn from them that I could use in my own life that would make me a little bit more impervious to stress-induced illnesses? So that's something that we're all going to talk about together tonight. Let's start with some definitions. First of all, what exactly is stress? Well, biologically, stress is our body's response to life's pressures. And these pressures could be anything. They could be things that you're experiencing at work that's stressing you out. It could be relationship conflict. It could be personal things that you're dealing with, like addiction or trying to manage your weight, things like these. These are all life's pressures. Many people will use what they call a stress scale to try to measure the stress in their life. So this is the first of these questions that I'd like to ask you. On this scale, with 0 being no stress and 10 being severe stress, how stressed out do you feel this evening? Pick one number, and then we're going to go to the poll here. And what you're going to do is, I can't use 1 through 10. The poll system doesn't work that way, but you're going to use letters A through J. So A would be 1 on the scale. B would be 2 on the scale. And what I'd like you to do is answer this question. How stressed out do you feel? Do you feel 1 would be the lowest amount of stress, 10 would be the largest amount of stress? A would be the lowest amount of stress, and J would be the highest amount of stress. So as you answer these questions, we'll see all of your answers appearing on the screen. And let's see where we all fall this evening. Has everyone had a chance to answer that wants to answer? Okay, so it looks like 50% of people aren't feeling very stressed, but we do have a few people who are feeling moderate to maybe stress is getting a little out of control. All right, so for those of you who are feeling like stress is a little bit on the high end, I'm glad you're here. And we can always learn something from seminars like this, so thank you for being here. So as our body is trying to respond to these pressures that we experience in life, either from work or relationships or personal issues that we're trying to deal with, our body's going to respond in a very specific way. And that's actually a very good thing, because the stress response is going to help us deal with that stressor. The first thing that we'll probably experience is an increase in breathing. You feel like you're breathing faster, and your heart rate and your blood pressure are also going to go up. And those two things are actually really good, because that speeds up delivery of oxygen and nutrients to the places in your body that need it the most, that are dealing with that stressor, like your brain, like the muscles in your arms and legs, just in case you need to run away from whatever it is. There's also this thing that happens where your blood starts to clot, and that might sound really odd for that to happen, especially if it's not really a physical stress, but this is your body's proactive way of protecting itself, just in case that stress, that threat, is going to be something physically dangerous to you. So if you get injured as a result of this stress, your blood, if it's thick at that point, you're not going to lose as much of it. And there's also an increase in the release of stress hormones. And these stress hormones are going to go all over your body to different places, and they're going to do some really important things. They're going to increase your feeling of alertness, so you can pay attention to what's going on. You can identify the source of the stress, and you can also identify probably the best way to get away from it. It's also going to start delivering energy to the places in the body that need it, like the brain and your muscles. And it's also going to enhance immune system function. What often happens, though, is we have an increase in either intensity or duration of our stress. So there are chronic things that we go through that we just can't get away from. Maybe it's a relationship problem that we're dealing with year after year. That would be an example of a chronic stress. Or it increases in intensity. Maybe we go through something really traumatic, like a car accident or something like that. So when we have stress, it increases in either intensity or duration. Everything that used to be helpful about the stress response can turn into something that's harmful. So for example, if your heart rate and your blood pressure stay high chronically all the time, then that's going to increase the wear and tear that happens to the heart and the arteries, and that could lead to cardiovascular disease. If your blood stays thick all the time because those clotting factors are always there, this increases the risk of things like atherosclerosis, which can lead to stroke or heart attack. If your stress hormones stay high all the time, then everything that was helpful about them in the beginning turns into something harmful. So instead of feeling more alert, you'll start to feel more anxious and irritable. Instead of having an increase in energy, you're going to start to have energy problems. Instead of having an enhanced immune system, you start suppressing the immune system. And as we're going to see later, if you have elevated stress hormones all the time, this can also lead eventually to brain damage. So for all of these reasons, when stress stays high all the time, it can trigger disease, and serious diseases like heart disease, asthma, diabetes, high blood pressure, ulcers, cancer, the common cold and the flu, and what we're talking about this evening, mental illness, depression and anxiety. So how many people in the world do you think have either depression or anxiety? What is the prevalence rates of these? Do you think it's 1 out of 100 people in the whole world have depression and anxiety? If so, you would answer A. If it's 1 out of every 50 people in the world, you would answer B. 1 out of every 25, C, and so on. You think it's 1 out of every 10, that would be D. 1 out of every 5 would be E. So what do you think is the right answer? How many people in the world are suffering from either depression or anxiety?
C.
C? Okay. No one has guessed the right answer yet. It's E, actually. E is the correct answer. 1 out of every 5 people, according to one survey that was done by the World Health Organization, suffer from either depression or anxiety, which is a huge amount of people, right? We're going to cover some of these statistics tonight, and then we'll cover some tomorrow. But there's also this very bad thing that happens where there's a lot of overlap between the two. So a lot of people who have depression also have anxiety, or people who start with anxiety, they deal with depressive symptoms. So the overlap between the two is about 50 to 70%. We're going to talk more about depression tonight, but just to give you a preview of anxiety, which is something that I'll cover more in detail tomorrow, anxiety disorder involves excessive fear and anxiety. So fear is this emotional reaction we have to something that's present right now. It's a real or perceived and imminent threat that we're trying to handle right now. So when you experience fear, that fear is automatically going to trigger the stress response. You don't have to do anything. All of a sudden, your heart starts pounding, you start breathing faster. All of these things happen without you even really being consciously aware of it. It just happens automatically. Anxiety is something that we're anticipating will happen in the future. So fear is right now. Anxiety is anticipating or fearing future threats. So whereas fear is going to turn on the stress response, anxiety could keep that stress response turned on long term, which, as we already know, could be a bad thing. Anxiety disorders, according to a survey that was done by the World Health Organization, affect 1 out of every 10, according to one of their surveys that was done. We'll see how the overlap happens in later studies that I'll talk about. But 600 million people deal with anxiety disorders. Depression is another mental illness that is very strongly linked to stress. And here we have the definition of what major depressive disorder is. So major depressive disorder is when you have 5 of the 9 symptoms that are on this slide for 2 weeks or longer. So you have this depressed mood, you feel blue all the time, particularly in the morning. You have diminished interest or pleasure in activities that you usually like to do. You have significant weight loss or gain in a very short amount of time. You either have problems going to sleep, or you wake up too early and you can't get back to sleep. And some people who have depression, they sleep too much. You feel restless or agitated, or on the other hand, some people feel way slowed down. You feel fatigue or loss of energy. You have impaired concentration, a severe case of brain fog all the time, indecisiveness. You feel feelings of worthlessness or guilt. And we also suffer from feelings of suicide or death. And not just thinking about death, but considering death as a way out of your problems. Now, since there's an overlap between depression and anxiety, often when you're depressed, you're also going to have anxiety symptoms. So you feel irrationally worried all the time. You worry that something bad is going to happen. So here's some statistics for major depressive disorder. According to one study by the World Health Organization, about 1 out of every 22 world citizens has this disorder, and that's 300 million people. So just to put that number into perspective, and I think I mentioned this a couple weeks ago during the church service, the US population right now is 327 million. So we're dealing with a nation-sized group of people who are dealing with major depressive disorder. The number of people who are dealing with anxiety is twice that. So a lot of people in the world are dealing with these stress-related illnesses. Here in the United States, we think there's 23 million people every year who deal with clinical depression, and that's about 1 out of every 15 people, according to one survey that was done. There are huge costs to these disorders, and we're just talking about depression this evening. So the direct costs, and that's just prescription drugs and medical bills related to depression itself, is $30 billion just in the United States alone. But for every direct dollar that's spent, we have about $7 more that are spent. And that includes things like other physical problems that come with depression. So chronic aches and pains, migraine headaches, these sorts of things. So medically related bills that come with depression. Those extra dollars also pay for workplace issues like absenteeism. People don't show up to work because they don't feel up to it, or low work performance. And also these indirect dollars cover things like loss of lifetime earnings when people lose their lives due to depression. The global economic burden is $1 trillion currently, 12 billion days of lost productivity due to depression, and it's the largest contributor that we know of to medical disability right now. It causes more days out of role, meaning people just can't perform what they're supposed to perform, either at work or in any other community effort that they're doing, than any other mental disorder. So there's a massive loss. There's a cost here of not only dollars, but also of human potential. There's also a cost when we're talking about human life. Major depressive disorder is the strongest predictor of suicide attempts around the world. 60 to 70% of depressed people have suicidal thoughts, and about 10 to 15 actually go through with those thoughts. In the United States alone, suicide is among the top 10 leading causes of death. There are about 65,000 people a year who kill themselves. In the world, it's in the top 20 causes of death. So about 800,000 people take their own lives every year. So because there are so many people around the world who deal with either anxiety or depression, we would hope then that we have some pretty good treatments for them. But unfortunately, what we find is that the treatment rates are pretty low. So less than half of people who have clinical depression around the world report that they get adequate treatment. But as you might predict, there are also some differences between rich countries and poor countries. So in poor countries, treatment rates are abysmally low. Only 4 in 100 receive adequate treatment every year. In rich countries, it's less than 1 in 4 people who receive adequate treatment. So what I want to do now is talk about, I think I skipped a few here. Okay. So what we often find is that people experience a period of stress right before they're dealing with an episode of either depression or anxiety. It often happens this way. And the fact that this happens is not really a new idea. We've known about this for a very, very long time. In fact, about 200 years ago, there was a French physician who, when he had people come into his psychiatric ward, the first question that he would ask them is, have you recently undergone frustration or reverse of fortune? He wasn't really using the scientific lingo that we use now, but the meaning was clear. He was asking them, have you recently had some sort of stressful life event? So we've known about this link between stress and depression for a very long time. But what scientists are trying to do now, and me included, since I've been studying this for a while, is we're trying to understand what that link means and how to break the link. Because if we understand how to break the link, then we've found a cure for one of the most common mental disorders in the world. Let's go on to the steps. So there are 4 steps of how stress leads to depression. In the first step, well, the first thing that I would say is that everyone has stress, right? I mean, we all deal with pressures in our lives. But not everyone gets depressed over it. Not everyone feels anxious over it. So the difference seems to be that some people have vulnerabilities in their life that set them up for a stress-induced mental illness. And those vulnerabilities, I think of them as being kind of in 2 categories. The first category is chronic adverse conditions that we're dealing with day in and day out for years or decades at a time. So in this metaphor that we're using, where we're traveling this road of life, the chronic adverse conditions would be the road itself that we're traveling. Maybe there's something difficult about that road that we're traveling. The second category of vulnerabilities would be genetic things or biological things. In other words, everything that makes us, right? So the factors that make up the vehicle that we're driving would be the second category. So let's talk about these 2 different categories. The first would be the road. So what chronic adverse conditions make us more at risk for depression or anxiety? One of these things would be poverty. So 1 in every 15 Americans deals with stress-induced depression every year. When you're looking at people below the poverty line, that number jumps, so it's 1 in 7. So poverty is definitely something that increases the risk of stress-induced illness. Lack of social support. Just a couple weeks ago, we were talking about how important social connections are, relationships, right? If we don't have that, we're more at risk for depression. Social disadvantage. As income levels go down and education level goes down, the risk of depression goes up. Other problems would be marriage and family problems. So a rocky marriage can make us feel depressed, but it's actually a 2-way street, where if we're dealing with depression, we can also experience marriage problems. And marriage problems and family problems increase the risk of depression. So children of depressed parents actually are at higher risk, and children of divorced parents are also at higher risk for depression. The other factors would be vehicle issues, right? The biological things or genetic things that make us us. So let's talk about different factors here. The first factor would be gender. So unfortunately, ladies, we are 2.5 times more likely to experience stress-induced depression than men. There are a lot of reasons for that. We don't really have time to cover that, but I'll tell you one-on-one if you're interested. But gender is definitely an issue. The second vehicle factor would be genes. Depression is what we call a multifactorial disease. That means that it's got lots of different causes, lots of different reasons why it happens. Sometimes we get depression because we have some sort of medical condition, and depression comes along with that. But we think that the risk of depression is about 30 to 40% inheritable through the genes that we get from our moms or our dads. And these genes, they affect a lot of different things. A lot of them relate to things that happen in the brain itself. So these genes will, for example, affect how different brain chemicals get transported around. These genes also affect how the brain develops and how brain cells connect to each other. So those are just some of the genes involved. What makes it even more complicated, though, is that these genes can actually interact with road factors. So for example, if you have a person who experienced childhood abuse, and that person also has a genetic mutation, then those two things together interact and cause an increased risk of depression. So these things all build on each other. These vulnerabilities all can build on each other and create a greater and greater risk for stress-induced depression. There are also biological factors that increase our risk of depression. One thing that can happen, for example, is inflammation. Inflammation is one thing that happens in the immune system, and it's got a very healthy reason for why it exists, but when it sticks around too long, it starts causing problems. So inflammation, one thing that can happen is it can cause an increase in a class of chemicals called cytokines. And when these cytokines hit the brain, they cause symptoms of depression and anxiety. So we know that inflammation is a biological risk factor for depression and anxiety. Social and development. So these actually issues were on the first slide that I showed when we were talking about road factors. But these things shape who we are. When we have chronic adverse conditions that we're dealing with throughout our life, that's something that shapes us as a person. So we have to include them here as well. So many times the road that we're traveling shapes the vehicle that we're driving, right? There are other things psychologically that can happen. So one thing is different personality types. We can use some technical terms here, but another way of describing it is how many here have read the books, the Winnie the Pooh books growing up? You remember the character Eeyore? If you have an Eeyore-type personality, meaning you're kind of always grumpy and you get very heavily affected by stress and you kind of anticipate stress a lot of the time, you have an Eeyore-type personality that increases the risk that you're going to deal with depression. So these could be personality traits that we have, like being an Eeyore personality. They can, people who have low self-esteem are higher risk for stress-induced depression. If you have poor relationship skills, communication skills, this is another risk factor. And if you don't interpret things. So sometimes we have some thought patterns where we interpret things kind of in a distorted way. We'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. So all of these psychological factors increase our risk for depression. One psychologist put it this way: psychological factors involve typical but dysfunctional interpretation of self and events. This increases our risk for depression, which kind of begs the question, so how exactly do we interpret a stressor? So right now we're just going to very briefly look into the brain and look at some brain areas, how we interpret a stressor. And what I'm going to show you tonight is kind of a simple, very broad description of how this happens. Tomorrow I'm going to go into a little bit more detail and show you how these brain areas connect to each other in different brain circuits. But tonight let's just talk about two brain areas, and you probably already heard of them. They're pretty common, talked about. The first is the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is this area right here behind our forehead that helps us with problem solving. It's part of what we call the executive part of the brain, meaning it's kind of in charge of the rest of the brain, and to a large extent tells the rest of the brain what to do. It can also override what the rest of the brain wants to do under certain circumstances. The reason why it has that power is because the prefrontal cortex has the ability to see or to kind of project itself into the future to see what are the consequences if I do this action or this action. And based on kind of looking at that, it's going to make a wise decision or an unwise decision. And it's also involved in problem solving. So the prefrontal cortex is a very important executive of the brain. The other part of the brain that we'll talk about this evening is the limbic system. And that's actually a group of brain areas that are all involved in kind of emotion and regulation of emotion. So two parts of the limbic system are the hippocampus, which is what I studied in grad school. The hippocampus is an area of the brain that deals with memories of things that happened to us, faces, names, where you've been, events that happened to you. The hippocampus is in charge of recording all of that and putting it into large or long-term storage. There's another part of the limbic system called the amygdala. And the amygdala kind of performs a parallel function. It doesn't remember memories, but it remembers the emotional context of those memories. So you remember something, and the memory that comes, or the emotion that comes flooding back to you at the same time, the amygdala does that. So for example, many of us remember the day of 9/11, right? And chances are you remember that day more vividly than you remember some other days way back then. So that's because the emotional context makes it so that those memories are laid down in a much stronger way. That's the hippocampus and amygdala working together. So both of these brain areas are very important. I wouldn't say that one is more important than the other. What I would say is that they're both important, but the balance between the two in communication and power is also very important. So let's think about a little scenario. Let's say that you're outside. It's gorgeous right now in California, so we can go outside, go to any park that we want to. You go outside, you decide you want to lay down in the grass and take a nap. So you're out there and you've kicked off your shoes and you're laying down, you're having a great time. And all of a sudden, a few feet ahead of you, maybe several feet ahead of you, you see the grass start to move. Like there's a little creature that's slithering its way toward you. And you don't know what it is, but it's starting to make you feel a little stressed, maybe, a little nervous. So immediately these brain areas are going to start working together to try to figure out what's going on and if it's potentially threatening to you. So the limbic system is going to go through the memory bank that's stored in your brain, and it's going to try to think of anything else that it knows of that slithers in the grass and that could be potentially threatening. And if it finds anything, it's going to immediately turn on the stress response. Say, this is potentially dangerous, you need to do something about this. So it's going to turn on the stress response. Automatically, you're going to feel your heart rate go up, you're going to start breathing faster. All of these things about the stress response are automatically going to kick in. The prefrontal cortex is going to also be working, and it might say, yeah, I know that there are some things that slither in the grass, but chances are the creatures that live in this particular area, and as I'm saying this, I don't know if this is true in California. It was true where I came from in Michigan, so I'm sorry if this isn't true here. But some of the things that slither in the grass that live in this particular area of California are not poisonous. They're not something that I would have to worry about. Maybe it's a snake, but maybe it's just a garden snake, so it's nothing to worry about. So the prefrontal cortex is going to kick in, and it could say, this is probably not as dangerous as we think. We can probably handle the situation. In which case, it's going to override the limbic system, and it's going to shut down the stress response. So that's the way these brain areas are supposed to work together. The perception of control of different scenarios is very important. So the second step that happens in this process is these people who have vulnerabilities already that increase their risk, they then have to deal with some sort of stressor. Some stressor comes into their life that they have to deal with. And it's something that they feel like they don't have any control over. So this sense of control ends up being very important. And it's also a loss that we experience. Many times the stress that we have involves some sort of loss. So there's a loss of a relationship, for example, where someone dies that we were close to, or a divorce happens. We have loss of self-esteem. We have loss of an important role. So maybe we had a job that was very important to us, and suddenly we lost that job. So we lost this important role in our life. Maybe we lost the role of breadwinner in our family. We have a loss of a cherished idea. Maybe we go through some sort of crisis of faith, and that causes us to feel some stress. Or we have loss of safety. So people who go through traumatic stress, like a natural disaster or terrorism or a car accident, for example, would have a loss of safety. Now, what the third step is these individuals who have these vulnerabilities and then get exposed to this uncontrollable loss, this stressor, they have an imbalance in these brain areas that I talked about that interpret and control stress. So, for example, if you put individuals who have gone through a very traumatic experience in war, for example, and they come back from war and they have post-traumatic stress disorder, you put those individuals into a brain scanner and then you show them images or you have them listen to sounds of war. Immediately what you're going to find is the limbic system in those individuals immediately goes on. And it goes on at a much higher activity level than it does normally for the rest of us. You have an increase in blood flow and activity. That's the hippocampus, remembering memories of war, having those flashbacks that PTSD victims often suffer from. They also have an increase in the activity of the amygdala. The amygdala is immediately going to kick in, and it's going to make the individual anxious and worried, hypervigilant, looking for threats in their immediate environment. The prefrontal cortex does the opposite. The prefrontal cortex in these individuals is less active than what you would normally find. So you have a decrease in blood flow and activity and a decrease in the ability of the prefrontal cortex to control and say what's going on. So what we see here is an imbalance in the way these brain areas are supposed to work together. Prefrontal cortex is less active than it should be. The limbic system is more active than it should be, which means that the stress response is going to be constantly turned on. So what we find then is if the stress response is constantly turned on, you're also going to have a constant release of stress hormones. These stress hormones go all over the body, they do things all over the body, but they can also go back to the mind, they can also go back to the brain. They go back to the brain, and there are receptors for these stress hormones in all of the brain areas that we talked about. There are receptors for these hormones in the prefrontal cortex and also in the amygdala and the hippocampus. And once the stress hormones go back to those areas and bind onto the receptors, what they do is opposite in those two areas. So they actually cause the prefrontal cortex to shrink. So all the brain cells start to shrink when they get constantly bathed in these hormones. But all of the neurons in the amygdala, in the limbic system, actually start to expand. So I don't know if you caught what happened in the slide. We had an imbalance to start with, and that imbalance got a lot worse the longer the stress response went on. So what we find in the last step here is that if the stress response gets turned on and then it stays turned on for a long period of time, over time you're going to have that imbalance get worse. So it causes brain damage in these areas where the limbic system gets a lot more active, the prefrontal cortex gets a lot less active, and that just reinforces this imbalanced viewpoint that we have. So we've gone through the 4 steps of how this happens. This is just kind of a review, kind of an overview of how this happens. So in these individuals who have these vulnerabilities, they get exposed to some sort of trigger, some sort of new stress that they feel that they have no control over. They have an imbalanced viewpoint, which means the stress response is going to keep turned on for a long period of time. You have a chronic elevation in these stress hormones, and that feedback causes brain damage, which just makes that imbalance worse. So you can have an imbalance that starts like this, and you see how this is a loop. You see how this thing can happen over and over and over again. So that means that this imbalance that starts out like this can start going like this and like this and like this. So you have a greater and greater imbalance the longer that these loops keep happening. Now, all of these brain areas have chemicals in them that get released. You've probably heard of a lot of them because a lot of antidepressants are targeting these brain chemicals like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. You've probably heard these names. But anyway, when you have a depletion of these brain chemicals in certain areas of the brain, that causes the emotional effects of depression. So we start feeling sad, we start feeling angry and anxious, we feel guilty, we feel despair, we feel anxiety. So these are the emotional aftershocks of what happens in this process. Now, once I understood this whole process of how this works, then it made perfect sense to me why we have developed over time two main lines of treatment for depression. So now we're going to talk about how you would treat depression based on what we know now of how stress leads to depression. The first way, of course, is we use antidepressant drugs. And this makes perfect sense to me because antidepressant drugs are targeting the end point of the whole process. They deal with the emotional crisis points of depression. So they try to increase the level of these brain chemicals back to a normal level. The other thing that we think antidepressants do is they start to make these two general brain areas talk better to each other. So they start repairing communication lines between these brain areas. But anyway, antidepressant drugs are helpful because they deal with the emotional crisis points of depression. However, if you look at this process, you can see that antidepressants don't do everything. They don't solve all the problems. So, for example, they don't actually target any of the underlying vulnerabilities that we might have. And they also don't prevent us from ever experiencing another trigger. Which means, though, that even if you are on antidepressant drugs, the next time you face a stressor in your life, you might find yourself right back in that loop. So antidepressant drugs heal brain areas and they increase brain chemicals, but they don't teach those brain areas to talk better to each other, to communicate better, and to restore that balance. For that, we need something else, and that something else is psychotherapy. Psychotherapy does often address directly those vulnerabilities, especially psychological factors or personality factors that we have to deal with, distorted thinking patterns that we have to deal with. So because it hits this, then it can restore that balance, train the brain areas to talk better to each other, and treat depression in that way. Understanding this process also gives us some ideas of how we could actually prevent depression. So based on this process, I can see at least 3 ways that we could prevent depression altogether. The first way would be to target any underlying vulnerability that we have. Sometimes there's a medical condition that's causing depression. If we treat the medical condition, oftentimes we will cure the depression as well. But the other thing that we can do is we can also promote overall brain health. If you do anything that's going to increase the effectiveness of the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system to talk together, to communicate the way they're supposed to, then a lot of times this will restore the imbalance. So this involves pretty simple things, exercise, eating right, drinking lots of water, getting lots of rest, getting lots of light exposure so we get lots of vitamin D exposure. All of these things are going to promote brain health and help us to prevent depressive symptoms. But there's also another way that we can prevent depression, and that is to directly address the trigger. If we know how to deal with the stress in our lives, then we can prevent the rest of the process from ever occurring. Which is where I kind of come in, because since I studied stress in school and I have been doing stress management seminars, this is really where I'd like to talk to you guys and see if we can come up with some principles of how we can avoid stress in this way. Now, in order to do that, what I'd like to do now is to tell you a little bit about some of the early studies that were done in this area. When we started learning that there was a link between stress and depression or stress and anxiety, the population group that we decided to focus on was children, because we know that disadvantaged children are at very high risk for mental and mood disorders later in life. And some of the vulnerabilities that these kids have are really severe. They grow up in impoverished homes. They have troubled family lives where they're dealing with abuse or divorce or alcoholism, or even their parents have mental health issues. And there's also a high likelihood of abuse or death in these kids. But what they found very surprising, the researchers, is that many of these children that they studied actually didn't develop depression or anxiety as a result. They didn't repeat the patterns of abuse that their parents did. So they started wondering, what's different about these kids? One specific study is called the Children of Kawaii study. So what they did is they followed almost 700 of these kids from the time that they were very small until they were young adults. So this was a span of about 30 years. And these kids had a lot of the same vulnerabilities: high poverty rate, stress during the time that they were born and in their early childhood, very troubled family lives, and so on. And what they found is that over 1 in 3 of these high-risk kids in this population grew up into competent, well-adjusted adults whose accomplishments equaled or exceeded those of their parents. So there was something different about these kids, or at least some of these kids, where they had the vulnerabilities, but they didn't have the resulting mental problems, depression or anxiety. And that something is a clinical term that we call resilience. Have you heard this term before? We hear it a lot. Resilience is the ability to bounce back from stressful situations. So what we wanted to know is what's different about resilient people. So if you're still hooked into this Poll Everyone service, you can answer this question: what do you think is different about resilient people? You have 3 options. A would be their road. They have an easier road to travel in life than the rest of us do. B would be their stress level. They have easier or less stress than non-resilient people. And C is there's something different about the vehicle that they're driving. They manage their stress better than other people do. So which do you think it is, A, B, or C? C is the correct answer. Yeah, there's something about their vehicle that's different. Whereas the rest of us may be driving cars where something's wrong with them, resilient individuals seem to be driving armored trucks around. So what researchers then wanted to know is, what makes their armor? How are they so strong when the rest of us succumb to stress in our lives? Now, when my stepdad and I told you we were kind of on these parallel tracks without even realizing it, he was developing stress management seminars, and I was studying it in school, in grad school. When we got together, we developed something called the stress management pyramid. And there are lots of different factors. Here in the bottom, it's kind of supposed to be like the food pyramids. You can tell that this was developed a long time ago when we still used food pyramid. Now it's a plate, right? But back then we used a food pyramid. So the base of the pyramid are things like exercise and eating well and managing your time well and getting enough rest, right? But the real power in the stress management pyramid comes in the top 3 components, which are developing a healthy viewpoint, having supportive relationships, and having what we call spiritual integration, which basically means you have faith in a higher power, a personal, loving God who cares about what happens to you. And what I found when I was studying about resilience individuals is they are very much hooked into these top 3 components. So I was reading this paper. It comes out of a secular institution. It's a psychiatrist at Duke University. And when I was reading her paper, I found this sentence. It says, resilient individuals are characterized by their personal competence and determination, the supportive relationships that they form, and their reliance on faith and prayer. And remember, this is a secular institution, and she was writing this in a secular research journal. There's something about faith that's very powerful. People who have a faith in their life, they deal with stress and trauma a lot better than people who don't. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about all of these characteristics that we found in resilience individuals. This psychiatrist at Duke, she wrote a paper a while back, and she said, okay, you want to know what makes resilient people different? I'll tell you. And she had a list of over a dozen things that they had discovered over the decades that they've researched now resilient individuals. What I'd like to do tonight is kind of give you an introduction to these resilience characteristics. We don't really have time to talk about a lot of them in detail. We'll talk about some of them. But the things that I don't get to discuss in detail tonight, I'm going to revisit tomorrow. So is that all right if we just kind of introduce the concepts tonight, and tomorrow we'll try to wrap them up and talk about them in more detail. The first resilience characteristic is something we'll call internal locus of control. This is something where people are looking into the future and they're trying to decide, do I have control over what's going to happen to me, or is it just going to be fate or chance or someone else who's going to control my life? And people who think that they control their own destiny end up dealing with stress a lot better than people who don't. So internal locus control is something that we'll talk more about tomorrow, but it's a very important resilience characteristic. Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist. He was also a Jew who was imprisoned in Auschwitz during World War II, and he wrote in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, the following: Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. The second characteristic is a strong sense of self-worth. Psychiatrist David Burns, who used to teach at Stanford, I think he's retired now, he wrote a really good book called Feeling Good. And in that book, he talks about 3 different pathways to developing a strong sense of self-worth. The first is believing that everyone is born with the same amount of worth. And Christians believe that this worth is given to us by God. And there's nothing that we can do to add to it. There's nothing that we can do to subtract from it. We all have the same amount. The second path is believing that no one can take away our self-worth. Since it's God-given, there's nothing that we can do to take that away from us, right? So there's no sense in worrying about it. That's in God's hands. The third way is to treat yourself as a dearly loved friend. So those of us who deal with low self-esteem, low self-worth, treat yourself as you would your best friend. And that means accepting you as you would your friend. You would accept your friend even though they are not perfect, even though they have problems and imperfections. Do the same thing for yourself. Accept yourself and treat yourself as a dearly loved friend. The third characteristic is having personal goals. There was a study that was done recently. The researchers were actually in the United Kingdom and Sweden. And what they did was they took 2 groups of individuals. They took a group of depressed people who are not depressed, and they just simply asked them, what are your goals for this year? Just write down a list of what you'd like to accomplish. And what they found was very interesting. They found that the non-depressed individuals had very specific goals. They said, I want to get a job promotion. I want to run a marathon. I want to start improving my exercise routine. Very specific goals. But what they found with the non-depressed individuals is they had less specific, more abstract goals. They said things like, I just want to be happy. I want to feel better than I do now. And this is a quote from the article. It says, this may not be surprising. A lack of motivation is a symptom of depression. But while not having goals will reduce your chances of failure, it also reduces your chances of success. Small successes can be very helpful in overcoming feelings of worthlessness in depression. Remember, worthlessness was one of the main symptoms of depression. So having goals in our lives helps with this specific symptom. We'll talk more about personal goals tomorrow. The next characteristic is a sense of meaning in our life. This isn't the same thing as saying that everything that happens to us has an inherent meaning. It says that with God's help, we can create meaning out of everything that happens to us. Nelson Mandela said, our human compassion binds us the one to the other, not in pity or patronizingly, but as human beings who have learned how to turn our common suffering into hope for the future. Viktor Frankl said, the way in which a man accepts his fate and all the suffering it entails, the way in which he takes up his cross, gives him ample opportunity, even under the most difficult circumstances, to add a deeper meaning to his life. The next characteristic is using past successes to confront current challenges. And here I'd like to tell you a personal story. I think we all know, we all can relate to this, where we look in our past, where we've been successful in the past, to help us deal with something that's challenging us in the current, in the present. Something that has been a challenge for me, I should say, in the past few years is writing a book for the general public in this sphere of how stress leads to depression and what to do about it. It started when Oleg and I were actually still living back in Michigan, and I had to make a decision when I left, I was teaching at Andrews University in their biology department. When I left Andrews, I had to make a decision of what I was going to do, and that's when I kind of had a strong urge, and I think it was a calling from God to start writing this book. And I fought against it for a long time, actually, because I felt like I should be doing something else and I should be contributing financially to our family. In fact, I went through the process of actually interviewing and getting another job at another university in that area, at Notre Dame University in Indiana. But the morning that I got an answer back from Notre Dame saying, yes, we want you to come work for us, God said, no, that's not what I want you to do. I want you to be writing this book. So that's what I continued to do. When Oleg and I moved to California, the pressure for me to contribute financially to our family increased, because I don't know if you know this, but California is a lot more expensive than Michigan, certainly. So yeah, I was being sarcastic. So I felt like I should probably go out and get a job when we moved here. But again, time after time, God kind of stopped that, and he said, no, I want you to keep working on this book. There was a specific week that Oleg and we knew that we just kind of wanted to make a final decision on this, whether or not I should go out and try to look for a full-time job. And we made the decision we were going to fast and pray during that week. Nothing much happened until that Friday, and Friday afternoon, Oleg got the news from his work that something financial was going to come through that we weren't expecting, that was pretty much going to cover our financial needs for the foreseeable future. So we kind of took that as a sign that God was going to take care of us during the time that I was going to be spending writing this book. My point of telling you this story is that many times when I'm experiencing a current challenge, what I do is I look back and I see where God has led me in the past, and I hold on to those experiences like an anchor. And I choose not to panic, and I choose to see what God is going to do in my present. Sometimes what we do, though, is we struggle with God's timing on things, because it seems like God often likes to wait until the very last minute to come through. But there's a quote that I like from, I think her name is Elizabeth Talbot. She wrote this book called Jesus 101. Some of you know this, I think. She said, I have come to trust God's timing even though I don't usually understand it. I have a motto that has helped endless times. Delays are designed to show the magnitude of the miracle. So when we get beyond our frail capacity to deal with a hugely stressful situation, that's exactly the time that God wants to take over and say, I got this, don't worry about it. And that's when we realize that we have never left the palm of his hand. So we use past successes to help us confront current challenges. Confucius said, study the past if you would define the future. Some other characteristics, viewing stress as a challenge. The Reverend Peter Marshall once wrote, when we long for life without difficulties, remind us that oaks grow strong in contrary winds and diamonds are made under pressure. Another thing that we can do is we can use patience, humor, tolerance, and optimism to deal with stressful situations. One time I was doing a stress seminar in Seattle. It was my first time visiting this particular city, and unfortunately, I lost my wallet in the airport, which I thought was kind of an ironic thing. You know, I was there to do a stress seminar, and here I have this huge stressor that happens to me. But as I was in the airport, and as the coordinator of the event was helping me search frantically for it, I just had to stop and laugh at the irony of the situation and say to myself, well, at least I have a good opening story to tell to the people who come tonight, you know. Guess who's under stress? It's me. There's actually a psychological reason why we need to deal with our stress in a patient and tolerant and optimistic way. And that reason is when we choose to view it in a panicky way, in an anxious way, this actually shuts down communication between those brain areas that we talked about. So the prefrontal cortex goes down in activity, and the limbic system goes up. And this just narrows down the possibilities that we can see in front of us for how to deal with that situation. When we choose to look at things in an optimistic way, when we choose to use curiosity and tolerance and even a sense of humor, that opens up those communication channels back up. And it increases the number of possibilities that we can see in our minds. Other characteristics involve adapting to the change, pivoting if necessary, or taking action. So Martin Luther King once said, if you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. Oftentimes we think that the strongest people are the people who can deal with crises completely on their own, but this isn't really true. Resilient individuals are the people who know how to develop a strong support system. And that support system, those relationships become part of their armor. They know when to ask for help. Vera Nazarian wrote, "Was it you or I who stumbled first? It does not matter. The one of us who finds the strength to get up first must help the other." The final component that I'd like to talk about this evening is faith. And this is something, of course, that I'll talk a lot more about tomorrow. Oleg and I used to teach a Sabbath school class when we still lived in Michigan. And there was one day where we decided that with this class we were going to teach on the book of Jeremiah. We were actually dealing with psychological issues and distorted thinking patterns. And so we were looking in Jeremiah, and Jeremiah, of course, is the weeping prophet. He's the prophet who dealt, I think, a lot with depression and anxiety. And he had a lot of struggles with God, with what God was asking him to do. So there are some chapters in Jeremiah that have some very strong feelings expressed toward God. Like, you're making me do this, but all I'm getting from my efforts is, contempt and insults from my brothers and sisters. And what am I supposed to do with all of this? But then there's some other parts of the book of Jeremiah where God answers those things. So in the very first chapter, God says to Jeremiah, "Before I shaped you in the womb, I knew all about you. Before you saw the light of day, I had holy plans for you. A prophet to the nations, that's what I had in mind for you. But I said," Jeremiah, "Hold it, Master God, look at me. I don't know anything. I'm only a boy." God told me, "Don't say I'm only a boy. I'll tell you where to go and you'll go there. I'll tell you what to say and you'll say it. Don't be afraid of a soul. I'll be right there looking after you." So as Oleg and I were talking to our class about this, one of the class members said, Jeremiah didn't have any problems with depression or anxiety. He didn't have any distorted thought patterns because he was dealing with reality. He wasn't making this stuff up. People were actually insulting him and treating him meanly. But maybe it wasn't a mental distortion that he was dealing with. Maybe it was more of a spiritual distortion where God was trying to tell him, there's a different reality that I want you to look at in this situation. I want you to look at this from my eyes, what I see. And actually, God's reality in this situation was scarier than what Jeremiah was seeing, because whereas Jeremiah was dealing with the insults and the contempt of men, God was staring into the eyes of demons during this whole thing. But yet, God wanted to help Jeremiah through it. So God often asks us to endure life's struggles because they serve a purpose in his reality. And oftentimes, in that moment, his reality is beyond our senses to comprehend and our minds to grasp. And yet we find that there's still a reason, in retrospect, that God can always show us for why he wants us to do things. Many times we're fearful. We get anxious, we get depressed, we get sad, we get burdened. We don't know why God is asking us to do what he's asking us to do. And yet we find all through the Bible, when God is talking to people, he keeps telling them, fear not. Because he's looking at things from his reality. And I think this is where the Apostle Paul was coming from when he wrote the following to the Corinthians. "We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. we always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. Therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. What we need to do as we are traveling this road of life is remember all of the resilience characteristics and use them when we think of them. We can try to find the meaning in what's happening to us. We can try to look at things in an optimistic and tolerant way. All of these things that we talked about this evening. And then at the end of that process, we can still hold on to God's hand. Know that we are utterly loved. And what's happening to us is because God has a hope and a plan for us. And that as we are traveling through this shadowland, we don't travel it alone. Thank you so much for coming this evening. I really hope that you will be here tomorrow for church service and for the afternoon meetings. Can I pray, or you're? Okay, all right. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for the people who came this evening. I don't know the struggles, the burdens that are on each heart, but I know that you do. So I ask that you be with them. Put a hand on each shoulder and help us to be able to feel your presence with us this evening. Give us comfort, give us peace of mind, and help us through this weekend to learn a little bit more about how to deal with the struggles that we're dealing with. Thank you so much for your love and your care for us, and the fact that we know that we are not alone. In your name I pray, amen. Thank you.
Thank you. Pam, thank you very much. Were you blessed? Yes. What an incredible amount of information.